Well, good evening, everybody. I'm grateful for this opportunity again to share with us, continuing on the subject of Yahweh is holy. Again, a topic that I think we really can only begin to touch. It exceeds our capacity for understanding, but I think it's still worthwhile to try to do so and to take a look at it. In the last message that I spoke, we looked at many of the references in the Old Testament to God's holiness and many of the ways that God interacted with us throughout history, throughout man, particularly with Israel, that revealed his holiness and some of the effects that had on the Israelites themselves. I close with 1 Timothy 6, where we talk about Yahweh dwelling in unapproachable light. I want to pick up here at this point again, continue on the subject of holiness, and particularly the holiness of Yahweh, and then move forward from there. So in 1 Timothy 6, Paul writes, He who is the blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings and Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, who no one has ever seen or can see, to him be honor and eternal dominion. And we see here quite a few references, one of which, when it speaks of no one has seen or no one can see, we think back to Moses, who wanted to look on God's face but couldn't. And then we see again the concept of dwelling in unapproachable light. Well, what does it mean for God to dwell in unapproachable light? I think in this we first touched the topic of God's transcendence, or the reality of God being greater than what is revealed in the natural world or the physical world here. God has gone to great lengths to reveal the unknowable. When we look at what Paul talks about in Ephesians 3 about God and his love, he's praying for the Lord to give us the capacity to understand that which we can't even understand. And again, similarly, as we reflect on the Lord, and especially when we talk on the topic of transcendence and even in his holiness, these things exceed that which we have the ability to even comprehend or perceive. As we look at these images and you look at things, you imagine in your mind God dwelling in unapproachable light. I think maybe sometimes as you look at the sun, you get a small picture of that, and that we have to shield ourselves from the brightness of the light. We saw it with, as I said earlier, with Moses in the cleft of the rock. But even as we look at the various pictures of the throne room in Revelation or Ezekiel or Isaiah, try to imagine, to see the image in your mind, and try to allow the details to fill your holy imagination, so to speak, so that we can begin to get a glimpse of what God's trying to show us. Because he was very particular about the way that he designed this, the way that he intentionally is revealing himself, and again, giving us insight into that which we can't see or know. So the reality exceeds what we see demonstrated there. What is an emerald rainbow look like? You know, I mean, rainbows by nature, when I think of them, they have many colors, etc. But we're looking at some eminence, some light, some glorious color surrounding him and emanating from him in his throne. I've yet to see a human being with this context. So on one hand, we know that his nature and his glory exceeds our own, but what's being revealed in that? You know, we see a reference to his mercy in his covenant with Noah following the flood, but also with that reference pointing to his eternal mercy and his eternal covenant with all of us. You know, you think about the limitations in our ability to perceive the beings in this room, the beings in the throne room, the angelic beings, the divine beings that surround the throne. Their descriptions are pretty detailed. You know, they have 6 wings. They're tremendous in size. Eyes all over them. Why eyes all around them? To think that God made us lower than them in nature on one hand, and that we are limited by our 2 eyes and even our ability to perceive only what we can pay attention to. Think about the capacity of the brain of a being that has that many eyes and what they can perceive about what's going on around them. But more importantly, they were created and made to be in the presence of God, so they needed that many eyes to be able to perceive the depth, the reality of the being that they're observing. So the takeaway one is that God is so beyond in his glory and his nature and who he is. But even us as little human beings remember our nature and our limited capacity. Every reference to someone who's been brought into the presence of a divine being in the throne room, or who's visited by a divine being, I think of Daniel or Ezekiel or Isaiah, they're overcome by the experience. They come to terms with their own weakness in the presence of the glory of one of these beings. And these beings, they're created beings. They're not bringing their own glory. They're bringing the glory of the presence of God, similarly as Moses did when he came down from the mountain. He had to cover his face. It wasn't because of Moses' glory. It was the reality of God's glory and presence upon him. So, again, why touch these things and why spend so much time examining the detail? Because I'm marked recently with the profound awareness of the holiness of God. And in this season that we're entering into here, during this time of worship, this concept has just been present and persistently present in a way that I think it's important for us to notice and to reflect upon. You know, we'll come through, like I said earlier, the aspect of holding to two truths. One truth does not negate another, and as we hold to both, we're increased, actually. We don't lose in any one area, but we gain. And one of the truths we're holding to is the holiness of God. And I want to spend some time visiting that so that as we step into the next truths, that we have a grasp on it. Whom no one has ever seen or can see. This is Paul's statement on the one who dwells in unapproachable light. What it's revealing is the nature of God and our nature of lack of knowledge of him. You know, there was a problem. We know of the sin problem, but there's a problem in the separation of man and God. We're natural beings. We're unable to perceive the spiritual. Jesus said to Nicodemus, you can read about it in John 3, he said that no one can even see the kingdom of God unless he's born again. So pointing to the lack within fallen mankind and mankind in general to even be aware of what we're talking about, right? So it's for God to initiate. Salvation is divine initiative. Salvation requires a divine response. And even the knowledge and relating to God requires him initiating to us. So when we look at whom no one has ever seen and no one can see, we're revealing the problem. We don't even have the capacity to know God or the ability to, unless he were to bring himself to us, right? If you look at his manner and the way that, like I said, even just analyzing the way that he's revealed himself in the throne room and in creation, but if we reflect back on what has God done to reveal himself into the earth, he's given us one revelation of himself, Jesus Christ. So that there are not distorted images or misperceptions, or, you know, you can look to 5 examples and try to derive the one that suits you the best. There's one. We're talking about the fact that no one has ever looked upon the face of God. So how do we have the ability to know him except Jesus, who has? So in Revelation 1, Jesus is referred to as a faithful witness. And it's something in one context we could almost miss it as a name of God. But there's a distinction in this because he's the only one who's seen, and he's the only one who can make known that which he has seen. And we don't even have the ability to understand what we don't know. So we look to Jesus only to know, Jesus only, for knowledge of who God is. As we look forward into Isaiah 6, verse 1 to 3, I'm looking here at the calling of Isaiah. And there's another throne room scene. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up. And the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And we see here beings who are needing to protect themselves from the glory of God emanating from them. And yet in that place of revelation, because light is pouring forth, it's more than just visible. There's a spiritual reality to this as well. And God is revealing himself in his presence to them. And what they're doing is exclaiming from their observation, the glory of God. Holy, holy, holy. And then, obviously, something else they've been given insight. The whole earth is full of his glory. And they see in creation the revelation of the glory of God. Another scene, and I recommend that you take some time on your own, because we really can only touch into these things, and I think we see as we spend time with the Lord and the Spirit reveals. But take a look at these throne room scenes, and as I've said, take some time to allow your imagination to ponder them. Slow down and meditate on the words and allow God to give you insight into this. But I love looking at these and imagining the place and observing it. In Ezekiel 1, verses 26 to 28, and this whole section gets into a very long explanation. There's great detail there. And above the expanse over their heads, there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was a likeness of a human appearance. And upward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal. So we see something here that's glorious that they're observing, and they're trying to use terms from things that they've seen. It's like gleaming metal, maybe metal that's been heated to be formed, but they struggle with the reality, right? It's something like gleaming metal. And he's describing Jesus' upper body here, right? Like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. I think similarly, as I've said earlier, what does an emerald rainbow look like? What does the fire gleaming all around him look like? I think it's a little bit of some detail to dwell as an unapproachable light. Although it's Yahweh, it's the Father who no one can look upon, right? But Jesus in his presence in the third heaven also is emanating this glory. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire. And there was brightness around him, like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. So was the appearance of the brightness all around. Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of one speaking. So we again see, this is Ezekiel writing in his encounter in the third heaven, and the way that the glory overwhelmed him in that presence, where he fell and he couldn't even speak. He fell on his face. Okay, so I think as I've referenced here, this throne room glory it's a particular revelation that God gave us to see him in a distinct way. We're talking about an indescribable God that is so far beyond our imagination, and yet he's chosen these specific details that we would see him and understand certain things. I think it's not for God's benefit that he reveals his glory, but it's for ours, that we would not be confused in our nature, but that we would understand the right relationship to him, and that's significant. And I think really that's kind of what I'm touching on here, is I feel the weight of the need to rightly behold the Lord and to rightly, we have a privilege in this hour. We have a privilege in this time in history as the redeemed to have access to the Lord. And I don't want to take away anything in our freedom and our access. Jesus has surrendered a great deal to purchase that for us, right? But in our access, I still want to hold the holiness and the glory of the Lord before us, even in the privilege of access. We see that for Moses, his exposure to Yahweh transformed his outward appearance and to some extent his inward reality. For the Israelites, their limited knowledge of God caused them to draw back in fear. And we saw a few examples of this earlier, right? If your awareness is only the holiness of the Lord and we don't have that the access given through Jesus, then our awareness is our own sinful condition, our own shame, our weakness, and the natural instinct of man is to draw back from God, not to draw forward in intimacy. They failed to see the distinction between Yahweh and other lesser divine beings, and they didn't know God, and they misunderstood his activity and his efforts to redeem man. And we see in Israel, probably by the time Jesus arrived, and we have the Pharisaical governance in Jerusalem, at least the religious governance. Obviously, there's the governance of Rome, but you have the most religious group of people that's probably ever walked the earth. They're keeping the law to the extent that they can, and to such a degree in their own strength, right, that Jesus had to chastise them. We see that in Matthew 23. He says, you think that you search through the scriptures because you think that in them is salvation, and yet you have me here, right? And then he goes on, though, to talk to them about how they're like whitewashed tombs, where they're dead on the inside, and they have a form of godliness on the outside, right? But inside they're dry and dead, right? So what we see is that an incomplete knowledge of the holiness of God doesn't produce righteousness, right? In fact, in some respects, it can distance man from God. We see in Jonah an example of one who was called to fulfill a purpose, and in some comical ways, he didn't walk in the purposes of the Lord, and God had to kind of make him do it. But he missed the heart of the Lord. Okay, so on one hand, we have one truth. Now I want to enter into discussing the other. In Hebrews, chapter 4, verses 14 to 16, the writer of Hebrews, I believe, is Paul, goes on to say, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence," or in the New King James, with boldness, "draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." In Jesus, we can now boldly approach. We have the high priest. You know, for all of history, in all the Judaic history, they had the high priest who would make the offering, and on the Day of Atonement once a year, he could bring the goat's blood into the Holy of Holies, and that was for the removal of the sin on the temple itself and for the forgiveness of the sins of the Israelites for the previous year. And by that grace, he could enter into that place. But with the fear of death, right? It was a pattern being revealed. And that's the pattern that is fulfilled in Jesus. And we see the fulfillment of that. There are a variety of these aspects to this role that reveal characteristics, qualities, realities of who God is. Every one of them. Just the blood itself, the high priest itself, the offering, the Passover offering, the offering in the outer court, the washing of the hands at the laver. Every one of these things gives insight and understanding of who Jesus is. In fact, every role in this is fulfilled by him. As we look later to another throne room scene in Revelation 4 and 5, we see reference to the lamb that was slain, as well as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And we enter into, as they look to who is worthy to open the scroll, we look to an examination, one of the worthiness to rule, but also of the worthiness to cleanse. You know, what's in the scroll isn't spelled out to say this is the judgment of God. This is the cleansing of all things. This is the establishment of his kingdom on earth. It doesn't say that in a line, but if you read what occurs as each seal is opened and as this process unfolds through the seals and the trumpets and the bowls, you see what's wrapped up in the question of who is worthy to open the seals. The seals on the scroll reveal the final redemption plan of God as he brings his holiness, which he's talking about, from the Holy of Holies to emanate through all of the heavenlies as well as the earth. When we look to Ephesians 1, Paul is speaking about a mystery that's been hidden for the ages, and the mystery is the uniting of all things on heaven and in earth in Jesus. God's final plan is to remove sin from creation. Okay? He's been at this for all of time. He's been doing it thoroughly and patiently and as gently as possible. And we see that culminating in Jesus' second return. And his mercy and his kindness never ends. But there's a point where, as the people of God, if we will accept the work of Jesus, and we see that discussed in a priestly role here in Hebrews, then we'll be cleansed. If we don't accept the redemption of Jesus, they'll be cleansed. They'll be removed. There's no room for sin or anything unclean. So when we look at the descriptions in Revelation 21 and Revelation 22 of the New Jerusalem, which is again a picture of this uniting that we're speaking about in Ephesians 1, when you look at that, what you see is the holiness of the most holy place descending to heaven, and the character and reality of the most holy place filling the earth and filling all creation. You see the removal of sin, death, sin, and the devil being thrown into the lake of fire forever, or the causes of sin, the consequences of sin, and all the problems of sin being removed and separated from creation. It's the washing or the purification of creation once and for all. That the character of the holy place could fill the earth. The character of the most holy place could fill the earth. Okay? So what does it mean then to boldly enter? To boldly enter where? See, what we're talking about on several levels is we're talking about natural reality. What I just spoke of, the culmination, is a spiritual and yet natural reality. When the New Jerusalem descends to earth and Jesus fulfills the cleansing of all creation, that's the physical culmination. But the spiritual culmination began with his death and resurrection. And I'd say a moment to mark would be the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, right? There was none before Jesus. He's the firstborn of a new creation, right? That the earlier title that I referenced to as the faithful witness, the next title for him is the firstborn of a new creation. See, the difference is redeemed man is unlike any man who's ever been before. Before the redemption, there was no ability for man to perceive the spiritual or to even relate to God, and God is spirit. So we needed him to become physical, which he did as Jesus, to relate to him. But now, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, because of the outpouring of the Spirit, we've been united with God by our spirit. Our spirit has been cleansed. There's nothing unholy in our inner man. So, see, you couldn't go into the most holy place with sin because no sin can ever enter. And when we look at Revelation 21 and the reference to the New Jerusalem, it says that no sin, no uncleanness, no sexual immorality, no cowardice. You know, Jackson referenced this a few weeks ago. None of that will ever enter the New Jerusalem. None of that will ever enter the New Jerusalem now or in the future. So when we can boldly enter in, we enter in by the Spirit. The Spirit which has been made holy and united with God. We have a new heart, right? And it's by that we fellowship with the Lord. And that's where the boldness to enter in, right? As I look at myself, I'm still wrestling through things in my soul, in my mind, my will, and my emotions. You know, you look at the references to the things that Jesus does. He sanctifies our soul. He cleanses our mind. Psalm 23, he restores my soul. This is an ongoing process. Were I to stand in the most holy place, I would fall under the glory of God in a physical sense. But in a spiritual sense, we're made whole and we can stand, and we do. It's important in our walk to recognize that who we are is one who's united in spirit. We are one with the Lord. That reality, this holiness that we've been looking at the pictures of, is the very reality of where we spiritually abide in our fellowship with the Lord. When we look at the restatement of the new covenant in Ezekiel, he speaks of putting his law in our heart and in our mind. It's a picture of the mercy seat. It's a picture of the ark, which contained the law, which contained the staff, which contained the manna, right? The seat upon which the blood was poured on every day of atonement. That's the picture that's pointing to the spiritual reality of God abiding within us. We don't need a written law within us. We have the Spirit of the living God united with us. Jesus in John 17 says, I am in you and they are in me, and they are in you because they're in me. Jesus is speaking to the Father, and he's basically saying, he says, Father, make them one as we are one. How is fallen mankind made one? We're redeemed and united by the same Spirit that dwells within us. This is the boldly access that we're talking about. We're speaking of like apprehending by faith the reality of being forever united with the one who shed his blood for us. And we are made one. The very wisdom of God resides within us. And I'm not saying this to hold us up. I'm saying this to look at and to not allow the enemy or any weakness within ourselves to diminish the fullness of what God has done in our salvation. We can, in the image of boldly entering in, it's not like we have to go into the temple. We've become the temple, right? We're here. This is where the Lord abides. This is the temple. So, there's an image here. If you guys could project the picture, there's just a kind of a, I don't know. When I saw a picture, there's a picture that from many years ago of JFK sitting in the Oval Office, and his son John is poking out from under his desk. I don't know. Many of you have probably seen it. This to me is kind of a cute picture of the reality of the access that we have to the throne room. Okay, you have here, a microcosm. It's the man who has the responsibility of leading the free world, essentially. And at this point, he's dealing with the Bay of Pigs. He's dealing with the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union. He's got to, if you, I don't know if they've been able to show you that picture, but I noted when I saw this picture, it's funny, you see any of the current pictures of the Oval Office, and the desk is always clean and everything is pretty, it looks like we're pretty squared away there, right? He was making no bones about it. This guy was at work, and he had a lot going on, and I think he probably felt a lot of pressure. And his son is just experiencing the reality of the peace of having his father there. And it's a small picture, right? John doesn't have the weight of the world on his shoulders. In essence, he's sitting in the office of the free world. But in this picture, imagine yourself as a son with access. I didn't even know, look at that little door there. There's like a door that opens up under his desk. Who knew that there was a secret door under the desk of the president? Nobody, his son knows, because his son has access to that place, right? So his son isn't ruling the free world, but his son has access to the place of rule and relationship to the place of rule by adoption. Well, not in this case, but by our case, by adoption, we have access to this place. Okay. I think the scripture that really portrays this well is Psalm 91, where it speaks in the ESV. It says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty." In the New King James, I like this version. It says, "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Mighty." We see the protection. We see, heaven was not downgraded by bringing in Jesus, all of redeemed man, into the throne room, right? The throne room didn't cease to be holy. We were upgraded to be brought in to the nature and character of that place. That reality exists here on earth now in redeemed man. See, he is still in the process. He's never paused. He's never not been on the throne. He is forever, until the fullness of time, in the process of redeeming and cleansing and bringing the reality of his holiness here onto earth. Okay? So I think, when we look at what we see in the truth represented in Hebrews 4 that portrays and reveals the access, the boldness, the confidence that we can have in the love of God to enter into that fellowship with him, right? We should have that ease in our heart, but we hold to the other truth with our other hand of the holiness of God. I think it rightly postures us as well as keeps us focused on what the purposes of the Lord are. You know, as we've in recent months had what I would perceive as an increasing reality of the manifest presence of God in our worship and in our services and in our time together, there's a joy in that, and there should be. And there should also be a sobriety in that as well. And I don't say that in any effort to lose anything that we have in the joy. We can hold to both at the same time, right? So this isn't meant to lose something. It's meant to gain something. It's meant to gain and retain the knowledge of the holy while still holding on to the joy of the access that we have in this process. I think that's a good place to close. The two truths to hold to, one in the holiness of God and the other in the access. There's a lot that I've begun to touch on, and there's a temptation to go down many of these trails. I think maybe at some future time we'll discuss some of these things. But I recommend taking a look at these places that we've spoken of in Ezekiel, Revelation 4 and 5, Revelation 21, Revelation 22, and reflect on what the specific ways that the Father has chosen to reveal his holiness in the most holy place, because he's more than that, but there's some intentionality in his choices that he's made as he's revealed that. Thank you all.